We are pleased to present this final webcast in the three-part series on the enforcement of the anti-bribery and anti-corruption laws in various countries. Our first webcast discussed the UK Bribery Act, which received royal assent on April 8, 2010, and will be enforced in April 2011. The second webcast focused on the new laws and regulations related to anti-bribery in China. And in this webcast, we are focusing on where it all began, the United States and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977. The enforcement of anti-bribery laws has increased dramatically in the last couple of years and promises to have a materially greater impact on the liabilities of directors and officers of local and global companies, both in terms of frequency and severity. And with me today to discuss the FCPA and its implications for directors and officers are Kevin LaCroix, partner at Oakbridge Insurance Services, LLC, and Will Fahey from the Management Liability Group at Zurich, North America. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. Now, Kevin, let me start with you. What actions are addressed by the FCPA, and what kind of impact can it have on directors and officers?
Well, the FCPA is a U.S. federal statute that has two operative provisions, one of which is an anti-bribery provision, and the other of which is an accounting transparency provision. It was first enacted in 1977 and amended in 1998 to bring it into compliance with the anti-bribery conventions of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. The anti-bribery provision prohibits the payment or attempt to pay a foreign official anything of value in order to obtain a business advantage or benefit. The accounting transparency provision, sometimes called the books and records provision, is designed to ensure that the financial statements of the companies involved reflect the company's actual transactions. It applies to U.S. persons, and as a result of the amendments in 1998, it also applies to foreign companies doing business or engaging in activities in the United States.
Okay, and Will, what is the impact on all this on directors and officers?
And since its enactment in the 70s, the FCPA has been a relevant law for directors and officers to consider, but certainly more so if you were an oil and gas company or aerospace defense or pharmaceutical company that was going to have large international operations and contact with foreign governments as part of their business. But I think what's happened more recently in the last couple of years is you've seen dramatic uptick in activity that's affected other industries like consumer products industries and other countries than we've seen before. And to a much greater degree. I mean, if you look at, according to a Gibbs & Dunn report recently, if you look at the last 4 years, you've seen 95 DOJ enforcement actions related to the FCPA. That's compared to 23 in the 4 years before that. Just the first quarter of 2010 alone, you've seen 36 enforcement actions brought, which is compared to 40 in all of last year. In addition to that, in terms of the money we're talking about $2.6 billion of fines and penalties related to the FCPA in the last 2 years. And these are numbers unheard of compared to anything we've seen before.
And what kind of jail time are we talking about with these actions?
Right, that's another thing. In addition to civil damages, you've seen in January of this year the first sting operation related to the FCPA ever brought by the FBI. And then in April of this year, we saw jail time against an individual for 87 months. Which is unprecedented compared to anything we've seen before.
And what can we attribute this uptick in enforcement actions? Either gentlemen?
Well, I think it's become an increasing priority of the SEC and the Department of Justice. And with that increased priority, there's been increased staffing. And so as a result of having greater resources, they've been able to be more proactive and bring greater amounts of enforcement activity and investigations.
Well, Kevin, how can directors protect themselves and their company from this exposure?
Well, the most important thing for any company is that it has a culture of compliance, that the message is consistent from the top down, that this activity that violates these legal provisions is not going to be tolerated. But even more importantly, the company has to take concrete steps, and that begins with having a comprehensive compliance program that's broad in scope, both in terms of who it applies to and what it applies to. In terms of the scope of who it applies to, it should apply not only to directors, officers, employees, agents, but also to business partners, and it should apply to all transactions in which the company is engaged. And to give it some enforcement teeth, the company should have a compliance officer that reports to the chief executive officer and the audit committee of the board in order to make sure that the company is following and administering the compliance program and that it's not just words on a piece of paper.
And Will, would you like to add to that?
I think Kevin's absolutely right. A company needs to make sure that they've got a lot of procedures in place to protect against corruption. I mean, you should have adequate training at the onset, and then you need to continue doing that training over time. You need to ensure that you have adequate communication within the company, such as a hotline. So, really just setting that tone, as Kevin said, of a culture of corporate compliance and reinforcing that is just paramount.
Now, do you expect this trend of more rigorous enforcement to continue in the future, or have we plateaued?
No, I do. I think that you're seeing new laws like the UK bribery bill, for example, that are going to, I think, increase enforcement. You're seeing the U.S. in a more rigorous enforcement culture as well. And generally speaking, I think in a global economy, you're going to see more countries cooperating together on enforcement actions that should contribute to that as well.
And Kevin, yeah.
A reason you'll see more in the United States is in the recently enacted Dodd-Frank Act, passed in July of 2010. There was a whistleblower provision added to the statute, which creates a bounty provision where the whistleblower, him or herself, can obtain up to 10 to 30% of the amount of the fine, which creates a substantial inducement for corporate insiders to step forward and bring these matters to the attention of the SEC. And I think that alone will likely increase the amount of enforcement activity that we're seeing.
Let's toss around some figures, because 10 to 30% that a whistleblower would get, and we were talking of hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. So, bottom line, Dad, what can a whistleblower, max out on in potentially one of these cases?
In terms of the range of what's possible, there have been, just in the last few weeks, there's penalties awarded in the range of $250 million, so a bounty of 10 to 30% of that would be $25 to $75 million. Obviously, that would incentivize most people to come forward, and that obviously was the intent of the statute, to encourage corporate insiders who are aware of these activities to bring them to the attention of the SEC.
Now, could this possibly have an outcome of, wow, somebody thinks I can make $25, $30 million, maybe some false alarms out there that they're calling up the SEC and saying, hey, my company's doing this wrong, but in reality, this person maybe was a little bit clouded in judgment based on chasing a big monetary reward?
It might well, and in fact, it would surprise me if it didn't, but I think that the SEC has safeguards to make sure that they're not lightly bringing accusations against companies and corporate officials that lack merit. So there will be investigation, there will be enforcement activity that would precede the actual filing of an enforcement action in the award of penalties. So there is that check mechanism within the controls of the regulatory bodies.
Well, with this probably increase in potential whistleblowers coming forward, what are the coverage implications in these scenarios?
Well, some things that I think every company needs to think about. First of all, the fines and penalties would not be covered, but they are going to incur significant defense fees in defending the actions. And they may also have follow-on civil litigation where investors or others might bring a civil lawsuit. And so the question really becomes, of these various types of expenses the company will incur, how will the policy respond? And there are certain policy provisions that potentially could significantly affect coverage in terms of policy definitions and policy exclusions.
And Will, what about follow-on civil actions, as Kevin was mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing a change in the number of, or in the types of claims brought against directors and officers, where historically directors and officers have been mainly focused on securities class actions as the type of claim that they're worried about. You're now seeing that expanding into a range of different claims: derivative claims, antitrust claims, breach of fiduciary duty claims, and some of those have FCPA allegations at their core. And so if you're a plaintiff's attorney now, I think whereas maybe 5 years ago you might have been looking for your bread and butter to file just securities class action and live off of that, I think now you're beginning to look at a derivative claim alleging an FCPA violation. You're increasingly seeing those claims as a greater and greater part of the claims brought against directors and officers.
And Kevin, anything to add?
Yeah, picking up on what Will was saying, there are a number of exclusions that are potentially applicable depending on what's alleged. He mentioned a number of the kinds of lawsuits that can be filed and types of claims. So there are various exclusions in the policy that could preclude coverage. One is the so-called commissions exclusion, which precludes claims based upon and arising out of the payment of gratuities or gifts. There are conduct exclusions for fraudulent or dishonest conduct. There's also an insured versus insured exclusion, and these new whistleblower provisions could be relevant to that. If the whistleblower is him or herself a director or officer of the company, they would be insured persons under the policy, and so if there's a claim arising out of their whistleblower activities, it potentially could trigger that whistleblower provision, which again could preclude coverage.
Well, can you discuss now on an FCPA claim exactly, what could be imposed and covered under the standard D&O policy, and as far as, investigative costs, I know those can run extremely high. Either one of you want to take a crack at that?
In some insurance policies, under the definition of loss, there's a small sliver of coverage under 2G 2B of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So there may be some small coverage for foreign corrupt practices, fine or penalty, but that's really not going to address everything you need to address. It's really going to speak to whether or not any exclusions that Kevin mentioned is going to knock something out. And if there are investigative costs, again, there may be some coverage for that, but generally speaking, it's going to be more for defense costs that arise out of the violation.
Well, given the recent significant, increase in activity, where's this all leading the D&O market?
Well, I think it's clearly a new area of exposure for the D&O insurers, and as a result, it will be an area of concern for them in their underwriting and in their pricing. Certainly will be a significant factor in their claims experience. For the D&O buyers, I think it is yet another thing that buyers and their advisors need to be focused on in structuring and placing the policy to make sure that it's designed to respond best should one of these investigations arise.
Yeah, I mean, while the FCPA has been around for a while, and Kevin certainly has been speaking about it as an area of concern for a long time, this year I do think you're in a materially different place than you've been before. You have 24 securities actions brought this year involving the FCPA. That's never happened before. So while some D&O carriers are beginning to respond to that and begin to realize what the exposure is, I don't think a lot of people necessarily have really grasped that yet. So, if that continues, if we see that go to 30 or 40 next year, I definitely think you will see the D&O community respond, maybe with higher retentions or more exclusions or higher pricing, things of that nature. But you're really just beginning to see the D&O community react now.
And wrapping this up, what are the key conclusions to take away from this webcast?
I think it starts, as we said before, with just strong corporate governance. I mean, since 2002 and the enactment of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, corporate governance has been an increasingly important factor for American corporations, so I think it starts there. Secondly, you want to make sure that your policy is giving you the broadest coverage possible as far as covering defense costs and not having an exclusion knock something out that otherwise might be covered. I mean, those are a couple areas to start.
Well, and I think it's important to remember that the D&O policy covers not only the entity but the individuals. In fact, the primary purpose of the policy is to protect the individuals. So you certainly want to make sure that the overall insurance program is structured in a way to maximize the amount of protection that's available for the individuals. And then final point is just a practical one, is to make sure that you are familiar with the claims handling personnel and procedures of your primary D&O insurance policy so that you're not meeting them and becoming acquainted with their practices and policies for the first time when a problem arises.
Gentlemen, we're going to leave it at that. Great stuff. Thanks for being here, and thank you for joining us for this three-part series. We hope that this information has been helpful to you. Now, if you want to add your points or have any questions, do please email us at directorsforum@zurich.com. And finally, thanks to our panel, Mr. Kevin LaCroix, partner at Oakbridge Insurance Services, LLC, and to Mr. Will Fahey from the Management Liability Group at Zurich North America. I'm David Folk Thomas. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.